Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today, we are reading Book 2 of the Belgariad, Queen of Sorcery, Chapter 6. And as always, you should support the original work by David Eddings by buying the original book. Chapter 6. Despite the promise of the brief sunset, the next day dawned cold and murky with a chill drizzle that wreathed down among the trees and made the entire forest sodden and gloomy. They left the inn early and soon entered a part of the wood that seemed more darkly foreboding than even the ominous stretches through which they had previously passed. The trees here were enormous, and many vast, gnarled oaks lifted their bare limbs among the dark firs and spruces. The forest floor was covered with a kind of gray moss that looked diseased and unwholesome. Heldren had spoken little that morning, and Garion assumed that his friend was still struggling with the problem of Natchak's scheme. The young Asturian rode along, wrapped in his heavy green cloak, his reddish gold hair damp and dispirited-looking in the steady drizzle. Garion pulled in beside his friend, and they rode silently for a while. "What's troubling you, Heldren?" he asked finally. "I think that all my life I've been blind, Garion," Heldren replied. "Oh? In what way?" Garion said, carefully hoping that his friend had finally decided to tell Mr. Wolf everything. "I saw only members' oppression of Asturia. I never saw our own oppression of our own people." "I've been trying to tell you that," Garion pointed out. "What made you see it, finally?" "That village where we stayed last night," Heldren explained. "I've never seen so poor and mean a place, or people crushed into such hopeless misery. How can they bear it?" "Do they have any choice?" "My father at least looks after the people on his land," the young man asserted defensively. "No one goes hungry or without shelter. But those people are treated worse than animals. I've always been proud of my station, but now it makes me ashamed." Tears actually stood in his eyes. Garion was not sure how to deal with his friend's sudden awakening. On the one hand, he was glad that Heldren had finally seen what had always been obvious, but on the other, he was more than a little afraid of what this newfound perception might cause his mercurial companion to leap into. "I'll renounce my rank," Heldren declared suddenly, as if he had been listening to Garion's thoughts. "And when I return from this quest, I'll go among the serfs and share their lives, their sorrows." "What good will that do? How would your suffering in any way make theirs less?" Heldren looked up sharply, a half-dozen emotions chasing each other across his open face. Finally he smiled, but there was a determination in his blue eyes. "You're right, of course," he said. "You always are. It's amazing how you can always see directly to the heart of a problem, Garion." "Just what have you got in mind?" Garion asked a little apprehensively. "I'll lead them in revolt. I'll sweep across Rendia with an army of serfs at my back." His voice rang as if imagination fired with the idea. Garion groaned. "Why is it that that's always your answer to everything, Heldren?" he demanded. "In the first place, the serfs don't have any weapons, and they don't know how to fight. No matter how hard you talk, you'd never get them to follow you. In the second place, if they did, every nobleman in Arendia would join ranks against you. They'd butcher your army, and afterwards, things would be 10 times worse. In the third place, you'd just be starting another civil war, and that's exactly what the Murgos want." Heldren blinked several times as Garion's words sank in. His face gradually grew mournful again. I hadn't thought of that," he confessed. "I didn't think you had. You're going to keep making these mistakes as long as you keep carrying your brain in the same scabbard with your sword, Heldren." Heldren flushed at that, and then he laughed ruefully. "That's a pointed way of putting it, Garion," he said reproachfully. "I'm sorry," Garion apologized quickly. "Maybe I should have said it another way." "No," Heldren told him. "I'm an errand. I tend to miss things if they aren't said directly." It's not that you're stupid, Heldren, Garen protested. That's a mistake everyone makes. Errands aren't stupid, they're just impulsive. All this was more than just impulsiveness, Heldren insisted sadly, gesturing out at the damp moss lying under the trees. This what? Garen asked, looking around. This is the last stretch of forest before we come out on the plains of central Erendia, Heldren explained. It's the natural boundary between Mimber and Asturia. The woods look the same as the rest, Garen observed, looking around. Not really, Heldren said somberly. This was the favorite ground for ambush. The floor of this forest is carpeted with old bones. Look there, he pointed. At first, it seemed to Garen that what his friend indicated was merely a pair of twisted sticks protruding from the moss with the twigs of their ends entangled in a scrubby bush. Then, with revulsion, he realized that they were the greenish bones of a human arm. The fingers clutched at the bush in a last convulsive agony. Outraged, he demanded, "Why didn't they bury him?" It would have taken 1,000 men 1,000 years to gather all the bones that lay here and commit them to earth, Heldren intoned morbidly. Whole generations of Erendia rest here. Membrate, Wasite, Asturian, all lie where they fell, and the moss blankets their endless slumber. Garen shuddered and pulled his eyes away from the mute appeal of that lone arm rising from the sea of moss on the floor of the forest. The curious lumps and hummocks of the moss suggested the horror which lay moldering beneath. As he raised his eyes, he realized that the uneven surface extended as far as he could see. "How long until we reach the plain?" he asked in a hushed voice. 2 days, probably." 2 days? And it's all like this? Heldren nodded. "Why?" Garen's tone was harsher, more accusing than he'd intended. "At first for pride and honor," Heldren replied. "Later for grief and revenge. Finally, it was simply because we didn't know how to stop. As you said before, sometimes we errands aren't very bright." "But always brave," Garen answered quickly. "Oh yes," Heldren admitted. "Always brave. It's our national curse." "Belgarath," Hadar said quietly from behind them. "The horses smell something." Mr. Wolf roused himself from the doze in which he usually rode. "What?" "The horses," Hadar repeated. "Something's out there frightening them." Wolf's eyes narrowed and they grew strangely blank. After a moment, he drew in a sharp breath with a muttered curse. "Algoths!" he swore. "What's an Algoth?" Brennick asked. "A non-human, somewhat distantly related to trolls." "I saw a troll once," Beric said. "Big ugly thing with claws and fangs." "Will they attack us?" Brennick asked. "Almost certainly." Wolf's voice was tense. "Hadar, you're going to have to keep the horses under control. We don't dare get separated." "Where did they come from?" Heldren asked. "There aren't any monsters in this forest." "They come down out of the mountains of Ulgo sometimes when they get hungry," Wolf answered. "They don't leave survivors to report their presence." "You'd better do something, Father," Aunt Paul said. "They're all around us." Heldren looked quickly around as if getting his bearings. "We're not far from Elgor's Tor," he offered. "We might be able to hold them off if we get there." "Elgin's Tor," Beric said. He had already drawn his heavy sword. "It's a high hillock covered with boulders," Heldren explained. "It's almost like a fort. Elgin held it for a month against a Mimbrate army." "Sounds promising," Silk said. "It would get us out of the trees, at least." He looked nervously around at the forest looming about them in a dizzying rain. "Let's try for it," Wolf decided. "They haven't worked themselves up to the point of attacking yet, and the rain's confusing their sense of smell." A strange barking sound came from back in the forest. "Is that them?" Garen asked, his voice sounding shrill in his own ears. "They're calling to each other," Wolf told him. "Some of them have seen us. Let's pick up the pace a bit, but don't start running until we see the Tor." They nudged their nervous horses into a trot and moved steadily along the muddy roads as it began to climb toward the top of a low ridge. "Half a league," Heldren said tensely. "Half a league and we should see the Tor." The horses were difficult to hold in, and their eyes rolled wildly as the surrounding woods. Garion felt his heart pounding and his mouth was suddenly dry. It started to rain a bit harder. He caught a movement out of the corner of his eye and looked quickly. A man-like figure was loping along parallel to the road, about 100 paces back in the forest. It ran half-crouched, its hands touching the ground. It seemed to be a loathsome gray color. "Over there!" Garion cried. "I saw him," Beric growled. "Not quite as big as a troll." Silk grimaced. "Big enough." "If they attack, be careful of their claws," Wolf warned. "They're venomous." "That's exciting," Silk said. "There's the Tor," Aunt Paul announced quite calmly. "Let's run," Wolf barked. The frightened horses, suddenly released, leaped forward and fled up the road, their hooves churning. An enraged howl came from the woods behind them, and the barking sound grew louder all around them. "We're going to make it," Dernick shouted in encouragement, but suddenly a half-dozen snarling Algoths were in the road in front of them, their arms spread wide and their mouths gaping hideously. They were huge, with ape-like arms and claws instead of fingers. Their faces were goatish and surmounted by short, sharp-pointed horns, and they had long yellow fangs. Their gray skin was scaly, reptilian. The horses screamed and reared, trying to bolt. Garion clung to his saddle with one hand and fought the reins with the other. Beric beat at his horse's rump with the flat of his sword and kicked savagely at the animal's flanks until the horse, finally more afraid of him than the Algoths, charged. With two great sweeps, one to either side, Beric killed two of the beasts as he plunged through. A third, claws outstretched, tried to leap on his back, but stiffened and collapsed face down in the mud with one of Heldren's arrows between his shoulders. Beric wheeled his horse and chopped at the three remaining creatures. "Let's go!" he bellowed. Garion heard Heldren gasp and turned quickly. With sick horror, he saw that a lone Algoth had crept out of the woods beside the road and was clawing at his friend, trying to hook him out of the saddle. Weakly, Heldren beat at the goat face with his bow. Garion desperately drew his sword, but Hedar, coming from behind, was already there. His curved saber ran through the beast's body, and the Algoth shrieked and fell writhing to the ground beneath the pounding hooves of the pack animals. The horses, running now in sheer panic, scrambled toward the slope of the boulder-strewn Tor. Garion glanced back over his shoulder and saw Heldren swaying dangerously in his saddle. His hand pressed to his bleeding side. Garion pulled in savagely on his reins and turned his horse. "Save yourself, Garion!" Heldren shouted, his face deadly pale. "No!" Garion sheathed his sword, pulled it in beside his friend, and took his arm, steadying him in the saddle. Together they galloped toward the Tor, with Garion straining to hold the injured young man. The Tor was a great jumble of earth and stone, thrusting up above the tallest trees about it. Their horses scrambled and clattered up the side among the wet boulders. When they reached the small flat area at the top of the Tor where the pack animals huddled together, trembling in the rain, Garion slid out of his saddle in time to catch Heldren, who toppled slowly to one side. "Over here," Aunt Paul called sharply. She was pulling her small bundle of herbs and bandages out of one of the packs. "Dernick, I'll need a fire at once." Dernick looked around helplessly at the few scraps of wood lying in the rain at the top of the Tor. "I'll try," he said doubtfully. Heldren's breathing was shallow and very fast. His face was still a deathly white, and his legs would not hold him. Garion held him up, a sick fear in the pit of his stomach. Hedar took the wounded man's other arm, and between them they half-carried him to where Aunt Paul knelt, opening her bundle. "I have to get the poison out immediately," she told them. "Garion, give me your knife." Garion drew his dagger and handed it to her. Swiftly, she ripped open Heldren's brown tunic along his side, revealing the savage wounds the Algoth's claws had made. "This will hurt," she said. "Hold him." Garion and Hedar took hold of Heldren's arms and legs, holding him down. Aunt Paul took a deep breath and then deftly sliced open each of the puffy wounds. Blood spurted and Heldren screamed once. Then he fainted. "Hedar!" Beric shouted from atop a boulder near the edge of the slope. "We need you!" "Go," Aunt Paul told the hawk-faced Algar. "We can handle this now. Garion, you stay here." She was crushing some dried leaves and sprinkling the fragments into the bleeding wounds. "The fire, Dernick," she ordered. "It won't start, Mistress Paul," Dernick replied helplessly. "It's too wet." She looked quickly at the pile of sodden wood the smith had gathered. Her eyes narrowed, and she made a quick gesture. Garion's ears rang strangely, and there was a sudden hissing. A cloud of steam burst from the wood, and then crackling flames curled up from the sticks. Dernick jumped back, startled. "A small pot, Garion," Aunt Paul instructed, "and water, quickly." She pulled off her blue cloak and covered Heldren with it. Silk, Beric, and Hedar stood at the edge of the slope, heaving large rocks over the edge. Garion could hear the clatter and clash of the rocks striking the boulders below and the barking of the Algos, punctuated by an occasional howl of pain. He cradled his friend's head in his lap, terribly afraid. "Is he going to be all right?" he appealed to Aunt Paul. "It's too early to tell," she answered. "Don't bother me with questions just now." "They're running!" Beric shouted. "They're still hungry," Wolf replied grimly. "They'll be back." From far off in the forest, there came the sound of a brassy horn. "What's that?" Silk asked, still puffing from the effort of heaving the heavy stones over the edge. "Someone I've been expecting," Wolf answered with a strange smile. He raised his hand to his lips and whistled shrilly. "I can manage now, Garion," Aunt Paul said, mashing a thick paste into a steaming pad of wet linen bandage. "You and Dernick go help the others." Reluctantly, Garion lowered Heldren's head to the wet turf and ran over to where Wolf stood. The slope below was littered with dead and dying Algos, crushed by the rocks Beric and the others had hurled down on them. "Going to try again," Beric said, hefting another rock. "Can they get at us from behind?" Silk shook his head. "No, I checked. The back of the hill's a sheer face." The Algos came out of the woods below, barking and snarling as they loped forward with their half-crouched gait. The first of them had already crossed the road when the horn blew again. Very close this time. And then a huge horse bearing a man in full armor burst out of the trees and thundered down upon the attacking creatures. The armored man crouched over his lance and plunged directly into the midst of the startled Algos. The great horse screamed as he charged, and his iron-shod hooves churned up big clots of mud. The lance crushed through the chest of one of the largest Algos and splintered from the force of the blow. The splintered end took another full in the face. The knight discarded the shattered lance and drew his broadsword with a single sweep of his arm. With wide swings to the right and left, he chopped his way through the pack, his warhorse trampling the living and the dead alike into the mud of the road. At the end of his charge, he whirled and plunged back again, once more opening a path with his sword. The Algos turned and fled, howling into the woods. "Mandorlin!" Wolf shouted. "Up here!" The armored knight raised his blood-spattered visor and looked up the hill. "Permit me to disperse this rabble first, my ancient friend," he answered gaily, laying down his visor, and plunged into the rainy woods after the Algos. "Hedar!" Beric shouted, already moving. Hedar nodded tersely, and the two of them ran to their horses. They swung into their saddles and plunged down the wet slope to the aid of the stranger. "Your friend shows a remarkable lack of good sense," Silk observed to Mr. Wolf, wiping the rain from his face. "Those things will turn on him any second now." "It probably hasn't occurred to him that he's in any danger," Wolf replied. "He's a mimbrate, and they tend to think they're invincible." The fight in the woods seemed to last for a long time. There were shouts and ringing blows and shrieks of terror from the Algos. Then Hedar, Beric, and the strange knight rode out of the trees and trotted up the tor. At the top, the armored man clanged down from his horse. "Well met, my old friend," he boomed to Mr. Wolf. "My friends below were most frolicsome." His armor gleamed wetly in the rain. I'm glad we found something to entertain you, Wolf said dryly. I can still hear them, Dernick reported. I think they're still running. The cowardice hath deprived us of an amusing afternoon, the knight observed, regretfully sheathing his sword and removing his helmet. We must all make sacrifices, Silk drawled. The knight sighed. All too true. Thou art a man of philosophy, I see. He shook the water out of the white plume on his helmet. Forgive me, Mr. Wolf said. This is Mandorlin, Baron of Vomandor. He'll be going with us. Mandorlin, this is Prince Keldar of Drasnia, and Beric, Earl of Trailhem, and cousin to King Enheg of Cherrick. Over there is Hedar, son of Chohag, chief of the clan chiefs of Valgaria. The practical one is good man Dernick of Sendaria, and this boy is Garion, my grandson, several times removed. Mandorlin bowed deeply to each of them. I greet you, comrades all, he declaimed in his booming voice. Our adventure hath been a fortuitous beginning, and pray tell, who is this lady whose beauty doth bedazzle mine eye? A pretty speech, Sir Knight, Aunt Paul replied with a rich laugh, her hand going almost unconsciously to her damp hair. I'm going to like this one, Father. The legendary Lady Polgara? Mandorlin asked. My life hath now seen its crown. His courtly bow was somewhat marred by the creaking of his armor. Our injured friend is Heldren, son of the Baron of Wildanter, Wolf continued. You may have heard of him. And Dorlin's face darkened slightly. Indeed. Rumor, which sometimes doth run before us like a barking dog, hath suggested that Heldren of Wildanter hath raised on occasion foul rebellion against the crown. That's of no matter now, Wolf stressed. The business which has brought us together is much more serious than all that. You'll have to put it aside. It shall be as you say, noble Belgarath, Mandorlin declared immediately, though his eyes still lingered on the unconscious Heldren. Grandfather! Garion called, pointing at a mounted figure that had suddenly appeared on the side of the stony hilltop. The figure was robed in black and sat on a black horse. He pushed back his hood to reveal a polished steel mask cast in the form of a face that was at once beautiful and strangely repelling. A voice deep in Garion's mind told him that there was something important about the strange rider, something he should remember, but whatever it was eluded him. Abandon this quest, Belgarath. The voice was hollow behind the mask. You know me better than that, Shamdar, Mr. Wolf said calmly, quite obviously recognizing the rider. Was this childishness with the Algoths your idea? And you should know me better than that, the figure retorted derisively. When I come against you, you can expect things to be a bit more serious. For now, there are enough underlings about to delay you. That's all we really need. Once Zedar has carried Kathrag Yaska to my master, you can try your power against the might and will of Torak if you'd like. Are you running errands for Zedar, then? Wolf asked. I run no man's errands, the figure replied with heavy contempt. The rider seemed solid, as real as any of them standing on the hilltop, but Garion could see the filmy drizzle striking the rocks directly beneath horse and man. Whatever the figure was, the rain was falling right through it. Why are you here, then, Shamdar? Wolf demanded. Let's call it curiosity, Belgarath. I wanted to see for myself how you'd manage to translate the prophecy into everyday terms. The figure looked around at the others on the hilltop. Clever, it said with a certain grudging admission. Where did you find them all? I didn't have to find them, Shamdar, Wolf answered. They've been there all along. If any part of the prophecy is valid, then it all has to be valid, doesn't it? There's no contrivance involved at all. Each one has come to me through more generations than you can imagine. The figure seemed to hiss with a sharp intake of its breath. It isn't complete yet, old man. It will be, Chamdar, Wolf replied confidently. I've already seen to that. Which is the one who will live twice? The figure asked suddenly. Wolf smiled coldly, but did not answer. Hail, my queen, the figure said mockingly then to Aunt Paul. Grollum courtesy always leaves me quite cold, she returned with a frosty look. I'm not your queen, Chamdar. You will be, Polgara. My master said that you are to become his wife when he comes into his kingdom. You'll be queen of all the world. That puts you at a bit of a disadvantage, doesn't it, Chamdar? If I'm to become your queen, you can't really cross me, can you? I can work around you, Polgara, and once you become the bride of Torak, his will becomes your will. I'm sure you won't hold any grudges at that point. I think we've had enough of this, Chamdar, Mr. Wolf said. Your conversation is beginning to bore me. You can have your shadow back now. He waved his hand negligently, as if brushing away a troublesome fly. Go, he commanded. Once again, Garen felt the strange surge and the hollow roaring in his mind. The horseman vanished. You didn't destroy him, did you? Silk gasped in a shocked voice. No, Mr. Wolf told him. It was all just an illusion. It's a childish trick that Grollums find impressive. A shadow can be projected over quite some distance if you want to take the trouble. All I did was send his shadow back to him. He grinned suddenly with a sly twist to his lips. Of course, I selected a somewhat indirect route. It may take a few days to make the trip. It won't actually hurt him, but it's going to make him a bit uncomfortable and extremely conspicuous. A most unseemly spectre, Mandorlin observed. Who was this rude shade? It was Chamdar, Aunt Paul said, returning her attention to the injured Heldren. One of the chief priests of the Grollums. Father and I have met him before. I think we'd better get off the hilltop, Wolf stated. How soon will Heldren be able to ride? A week at least, Aunt Paul replied. If then. That's out of the question. We can't stay here. He can't ride, she told him firmly. Couldn't we make a litter of sort? Dernick suggested. I'm sure I can make something we can sling between two horses so we can move him without hurting him. Well, Paul? Wolf asked. I suppose it will be all right, she said a bit dubiously. Let's do it, then. We're much too exposed up here, and we've got to move on. Dernick nodded and went to the packs for rope to use in building the litter.